it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in a clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on podcastufo.com. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. And we have a redo show tonight. Last night was a train wreck. And Jordan Bonaparte from the Nighttime Podcast was good enough to give us another try. We're going to be on for an hour. I wouldn't call this a bonus show, so I would just call it a I'm sorry show for last night type of thing. And if you have a Mac and you do any type of audio through it, you'll know that they're different from a PC. You have to have some type of virtual cable to make audio go from one place to another. Anyway, you need to create a multi-output device. I know I'm going a little techie here for some people, but so you create a multi-output device, and when I packed up my gear to go to Phoenix, and then I didn't get out. Of course, the flight was canceled. So when I put my studio back together, the mixing board was not recognized as part of that output device. When I checked it out, I found it this morning. I found the issue, and it was unchecked. It unchecked itself. So that was all it took was one little check, and I could have had a great show last night. But we are going to just forget about that and move ahead. So I want to just announce that I do have a new show coming up. The first episode is coming up on the 27th of this month with the Enos. Everything You Know Is Wrong. And the name of the show that I have is the Everything Else. The Everything Else Show is what it's actually called. And so that is launching, and that's going to be YouTube stream only. That's all that's going to be. It's not going to be a podcast or anything like that. I've been getting a lot of email, and people have been asking, well, is the podcast still going to carry on? Yes, the answer is yes. The UFO show will be here every single Wednesday, just the way it has been, and so that's just going to continue the way it is. The Everything Else show, it's going to have some interesting guests about everything else you can think of. Things that I really want to talk about, and just interesting people. And if you want to check out the website, I already have I think 5 or 6 shows lined up, and that's everything-else-show.com. It's also on my menu bar at podcastufo.com. If you're listening live on YouTube right now, I hope you jump in the chat room. That also pops up on podcastufo.com every week just before the show. And with no further ado, I think I'm going to welcome our guest. And you better unmute your mic. And Jordan, how you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, so long as the people out there can hear.
Yeah, you know what? I don't even know if I dare to ask if after last night.
Yeah, if they can't, let's just do it anyway.
Yes. Okay. I kind of agree with you. It looks like it might be working. I just want to double check. You just never know, but I did test many times today. So hopefully everything is just fine here. Okay, so a little bit. Look, all these people are back in the chat room. You know what? I got to tell you, we kind of did the show last night. Got through it. I called it the Trainwreck UFO because of Phil, who called in, named it that. I thought that was a really good name for it. And we just moved ahead. There was so much activity in the chat, I couldn't stop. I had to stay. And people called in, which got me thinking, if a guest ever cancels on me, this YouTube is so active that I think I'll do a call-in show instead of cancel the show, So and everything should be working right, and everyone's saying it's all working. Can you believe it?
They're shocked. Yeah, I think a call-in show is a cool idea, and there's probably a lot of people who haven't been following your show, since the beginning, so they don't know a lot about you and what got you into it. Like for myself, I had only found out about your show. I think it was probably about 3 months ago. I put a post up on a UFO subreddit on the webpage or on the webpage Reddit, which I use all the time.
Yeah.
And I asked people to give me recommendations for the best UFO themed podcasts. And yours was over and over again. People were recommending your show and Alejandro's Open Minds.
Open Minds, right.
Yeah.
Well, that's
so I was
nice
getting
to hear.
Yeah, so that's how I stumbled upon you, and I pretty much the first episode I listened to was one from your back catalog with Don Ledger, who's a friend of mine.
Oh yeah,
and immediately I knew your show was just what I was looking for, and I've been proudly supporting you ever since and listening to the full 2 hours.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, and I got to tell you, I'm going to give that back at you because you run a really good show. It's called the Nighttime Podcast, and it's a different type of format than my show. Very well done. You have a very well thought out monologues, and then you go into cases and you actually talk with witnesses. Great job. I really enjoy your show. I actually listened to a couple of shows today.
Awesome.
So the listener out there, check it out. It's the Nighttime Podcast. And it's you get into everything like I'm going to get into the other show that I'm doing, and everything from true crime, which there's some great stories there, to Bigfoot, to UFOs, to the whole deal. And then I even listened to I want to talk about it because I listened to your grandfather, his sighting, and is that what actually sparked your interest? The story floating around your family about your grandfather, and grandmother.
Yeah, that's what first got me into the UFO phenomenon. Pretty much, I've lived with it since I was a young kid. I think I was probably maybe about 5 years old when I had first heard the story of my granddad and grandma had saw something they couldn't explain in the sky. My grandfather was convinced it was a UFO, but nobody really in the family gave it much thought. He didn't bring it up often, and whenever it was brought up, it was just kind of in jests. Someone in the family would just kind of crack a joke about it, and that pretty much went on my whole life. But when I was maybe say 10 years old and the show X-Files came out, I started to then learn more and more about it and get more and more into it. So I always wanted to hear my granddad's story. But what ended up happening is my granddad would drop little hints or just say like kind of a little detail, but my grandmother was the opposite, where she didn't want it ever mentioned, and if he mentioned it around her, she would pretty much shut it down. And what my first 2 episodes of the Nighttime Podcast are is this all happened, I guess, about 2 years ago. Up until this point, nobody in my family had ever heard the entire story of what happened with my grandparents. They just, again, knew the basics, that they saw something in the sky they couldn't explain. My granddad, about 2 years ago, he was, I guess, 91 at the time. We had just finished supper at his house, and he had offered to tell me the story. I brought it up by telling him about, actually, I was reading a book about Shag Harbour at the time, and I mentioned the book to him as a way to kind of move the conversation towards his sighting, and he agreed to tell me the story. So what I did was, with my cell phone in hand, he told me the story, I recorded it, and from there I started kind of picking through all the different pieces of the story and just taking every little bit of it that was that had a concrete fact to it. For example, he gave the date. He told me what the weather was like. He described where he was going. So I took all those details, went to the public archives, got the old newspapers, got death records, the whole thing, and just tried to find out if I could which parts of the story I could confirm to be true, basically just to see what came out of it. And that's really what started what brought it from an interest in UFO sightings and stories to more so getting into the investigation was my granddad's sighting.
So you really, you actually, is it all through your own that you came up with these ideas on how to research this, or did Don Ledger help you out or someone like that?
Well, it started on my own. Really what I did was I took the main details. One was that he was on the way to a friend's wake. So I went to the public archives to get the death records to confirm that somebody named, I forget the name, Graham McIntyre. So I confirmed somebody with that name died at the date that my granddad said. Sure enough, he did. So then I went and got the newspaper, found the obituary to find where the wake was. It all matched up with the story. I had, through the archives, I was also able to gather historical weather data to confirm the weather was the way he described it to be. So I kind of did everything I could think of on the surface. And at the end of it, everything still lined up in it. And it looked like, every piece of his story was true. But then I bought this book, which your readers may be able to read. It's called Maritime UFO Files by Don Ledger. At the time, I didn't know who Don Ledger was, but I read this book, which outlines a lot of UFO sightings from the part of the world I live in, which is the eastern part of Canada. We call it the Maritimes. Don Ledger put this book together, outlining a whole slew of UFO sightings. So I was kind of reading through them to see which of them had details similar to my granddad's, and I found a lot of them that had commonalities to what my granddad and grandmother explained. From there, I emailed Don Ledger basically to get his advice on where to go next. And that's how I first met him, and that's how he became involved. He actually appeared on the second episode talking about my granddad and grandmother's sighting, which happened in 1986 in Monroe's Point, which is a mountainous area in Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia, where I'm from.
Well, when your grandfather described it, this craft basically just showed up. It was a disc. It was over his car, and the thing he said that really I really like to hear, because I really love these cases. It made his car stall. And there is one researcher, and I can't remember his name, that's all he does. He specializes in the stalled cars. I think this was going back to the 70s or something. But this has happened for, decades and decades, where someone's car will stall. And, I know someone that personally that had a cigar-shaped craft go over, and all the cars stalled in the mountain pass. And then the thing passes over and the car starts up again, which is pretty amazing.
And that's just how my granddad and grandma described it. Is basically once the object was over their car, they lost all power. Had never had a problem with the car up until that point. And as the object left overhead their car, he just turned the key and the car started right back up without any problem. He's convinced what he saw was some type of alien spacecraft, although he did report it to anybody he could think of that would be relevant. And the official explanation basically of everyone he spoke to was that it was a fireball in the sky. And it turned out during my investigation into my granddad's sighting, there actually was a meteor shower that occurred or that was visible in Newfoundland, which is a province near Nova Scotia. So there is some doubt cast by the fact that there was a meteor shower that night, and it was a fairly clear sky. But a meteor shower shouldn't stall your car engine, and a meteor doesn't hover above your car and then after 30 seconds travel away from your car slowly. So I believe my granddad and grandma.
Right. Well, it's always that way when someone talks about Venus or whatever it is, that you always hear these things where they try to explain it away. It's the swamp gas thing, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I find in my experience interviewing people who've witnessed things they can't explain in the sky, so the stories are often vague, and taking the details of the story, it seems to me almost impossible to conclusively say one way or another what they saw. But I just find it's the credibility of the person that really can carry a story. And I know it's different for me because I'm talking about my granddad and grandmother. But my grandmother is the most grounded, reasonable, logical person you could ever imagine. And if my grandmother says something happened, there's no question at all. It's the absolute 100% truth. She's your typical sweet, God-fearing grandma, and she would absolutely not be prone to fantasy or exaggeration. And even now, you'll hear it in the second episode of my show when my grandmother describes what she saw that night. Even now, like 30 years later, you can hear in her voice she's affected by it. She's embarrassed by the fact that she's affected by it. And she still even sounds a little bit scared. Like in when I talked to her in that episode, you can hear her mood change completely. And knowing her as well as I do, it just makes it all that more compelling.
Right. And so are you? You did actually interview your grandmother and that as well. I didn't get a chance to listen to that part of it. Your grandfather was very convincing. Did they have basically the same story?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting because my granddad's version of the story, and I say version not because they're different, but because they describe it in such a different way. My granddad's version is more so the physical event. Like he talks about, the object hovering above them, the car stalling, the object slowly making his way away. So he describes it more in, physically what happened, where my grandmother, who talks in the second episode, she doesn't as much get into what physically happened. She more talks in depth about how terrified she was, how embarrassed she was afterwards, how she's what people may think now that she's telling the story. Because I'll give you a bit of background on it. What ended up happening was when I released the first episode, in which my granddad shared his story, most people in my family didn't know the story. So this was the first time a lot of people in my family were hearing it, as well as the story was in the papers locally. When I had released the episode, my local newspaper and CBC had covered the episode of this podcast. And so then, the story was out, both to my family as well as to my grandparents' peers. Then it was about 2 weeks later, my grandmother was willing then to talk about it. So it was kind of surprising and unexpected. But when the second episode came about, she described why she didn't want people talking about this and why she was afraid. And I had Don Ledger on that episode, and he told me her feelings and her reaction to it was all too common, where so many people are afraid to come forward and associate themselves with, something as unusual to the layman as the UFO phenomenon.
Right. Now, so she actually spoke about it, but you said that she felt nervous and she didn't want to talk about it. And is that because was she ever ridiculed that you know of? Did they report it together, or was it just him reporting it alone?
It was him reporting it and her trying to talk him out of it. Her thing was like, let's just leave this be and move on with our lives without ever mentioning it again, that sort of thing. My granddad did go ahead and report it regardless. They were never ridiculed by it because most people didn't know. As deep as the ridicule would have gotten would be just an example. We would be sitting around the table having supper. Somehow the topic of UFOs or ghosts or aliens or whatever would come up, and my granddad may say something like, I don't know if anyone in Canada has ever gotten as close to one as I did, back in '86. And my grandmother would say, shut up about that, and that'd be about it. So it wasn't really, and people at the table, like let's say my uncle, he'd roll his eyes, and that would be about as far as it ever went. But then when they finally came out and told the story, everybody in my family kind of got involved and listened and heard it. And now my granddad, he's now 94, and he almost exclusively talks about UFOs, aliens, and Oak Island. Those are the three things he'll talk about. So we have lots of long conversations about these topics.
Yeah, Oak Island is actually fascinating me a bit. So does he actually listen to your show? Has he listened to your show?
He does. He's in the hospital. He broke his hip a year and a half ago, and he's been in a bed in the hospital ever since. So whenever I release an episode on a thumb drive, I send him a copy, the file, and he listens to them all the time. And I'm actually going to give him some copies of your show because he loves discussions on the UFO phenomenon. He's 94, but he's sharp as a tack. I think if he had the energy, he'd be a great guest for you. But I don't think he could maintain 2 hours.
Right. Now, so what does he think about the Shag Harbour incident, and did he know about it when that happened, or just did he start paying attention after his own sighting?
He started paying attention to it, I think, well after his own sighting, because what happened with my grandparents was in '86, and although Shag Harbour, the event occurred in '67, it wasn't until the early '90s when Chris Stiles reopened an investigation that it became what it is today, which is described as Canada's Roswell. Although a lot of people think it's there's even more evidence of Shag Harbour than there is in Roswell. But when this happened to my grandparents in '86, nobody was talking about Shag Harbour.
Mm-hmm. So when you was researching Shag Harbour, or you did your episodes on Shag Harbour, you talked to one of the witnesses, actually, right?
Yeah, that was my first step. Luckily, unlike a lot of other shows and podcasts and stuff, I focus on topics that occur in my province and in the part of Canada I live in, which is the eastern part. I live just about an hour and a half drive away from Shag Harbour. So when I decided to cover that, my first step was just to try to reach out to any people who lived near me that were involved. And luckily, one of the first that I was able to meet with was Laurie Wickens. He was the first person on the scene. He was also the first person that notified the RCMP of the downed aircraft. He also went out on the boat into the water to actually, hopefully, he was hoping to rescue people from a downed airplane, but didn't end up finding anyone. But he was the first person I got involved with. I met him at a local Tim Hortons coffee shop in true Canadian fashion. We had coffee, and he told me the story.
Now, you have a recording, right? Are you able to play that recording?
Yeah, I would love to, and I will. This was played in the second episode I released on Shag Harbour. What this is the quality's not perfect, but what it is Laurie Wickens, who's more than anyone associated with Shag Harbour, because again he was the first one to report it, and pretty much any documentary or anything associated with Shag Harbour, he's usually involved in some way. This was when I had first got in touch with him. I actually wrote him a letter because I found his address. That's how I reached him. We mailed and then phoned back and forth. He agreed to meet me at a local Tim Hortons coffee shop. So this is us sitting down with a coffee, and I just pretty much just asked him to tell me the story from start to finish. This clip's about 3 minutes long, and I'll play it for you now, so hopefully you can hear this okay.
All right, Laurie, so I'm recording it now. So I won't do it like an interview or anything. You can just, in your own words, just kind of describe from the point where you were driving and first saw the lights.
All right, there was four of us coming from Barrington, going towards Woods Harbour, and we was in the middle of Shag Harbour. I'd say that's roughly where it was. And on the right-hand side of the car, up over the woods, out over the water, we see lights at first, and then as we paid attention to them, one would be on, two would be on, the three, the four, it'd all be on for a second. Then they would go out and start over in that sequence. And it seemed to be going along with us, no faster than what we was driving. It must have went along with us for about 5 minutes drive or close to it. And as we made a corner and started going up a hill, the light went from flying level to a 45-degree angle, and as we was going up over the hill, we lost sight of it. For about 2 seconds, we made the top of the hill, we could see the light in the water, and we did not do this in paper.
Oh, sorry. I think my phone went to sleep. Let me
We did not stop there. We went directly to the phone, called the RCMP. They said, we just seen a plane crash. He asked me, he said, what you been drinking? I said, nothing. And he asked me for the number of the phone booth, and I went to get back in the car, and the phone rang, and I answered it, and he asked me where we could meet to see it in the water, and I told him the Moss plant. And so we drove down there, and we was there 5 minutes or so before the first police car came, then another one, and we could see the light drifting down by. We watched that for about 20 minutes before it went out.
What made you so sure it was a plane crash?
Well, we just thought it was a plane. We didn't know it. No. Probably never even heard of a UFO before.
And the lights, when I've seen drawings of it, it's always the four lights kind of right in a row. And to me, it would look like maybe the lights on the wing of a plane. Is that what you thought the lights were?
No, and they got the lights way too bright for what we see that night. And it was... The lights looked like they was on something long. Other than that, I can't tell. Didn't look.
And after you called whoever you called, and you went back to the site and saw the lights in the water.
Just one light. There was only one light in the water. When we made the top of the hill, there was one light in the water, and we just noticed the light then. But when we come back and was really looking at the light, it looked like a half of a globe upside down with a yellowish colored light in it.
And that's where the word dark object comes from. It was just a dark object with the
that's what some other people reported, and that's where they picked.
It actually comes from military telex that refers to it. I don't have it on.
Okay, yeah.
We never noticed nothing but light.
You just saw the light.
All we saw is the light, and it looked like the light was that flash on the water. To me, other people had got other opinions, but to me, that's mine. And the 3 RCMP officers come there and seen it, and there was 4 of us, or 5 of us in the car, but 4 of us, Normie Smith, and some of his relations come and see it in the water, and part there, and some other people. So,
how long was the light sitting there, roughly?
It was probably in the water an hour from the time we first see it till the light disappeared. Drifting down by there with the tide. From the time we see it, went to the phone booth, called, come back and watched it with the RCMP coming, then walked up over the hill and watched it drift down to where it finally went out. We probably watched it for close to an hour.
Wow. And you were on the site, watched it for about an hour. How long were you there before you left on the scene?
Well, after the light went out, me and one of the RCMP officers went down and went out on the Coast Guard Cutter 101. And the other guys went down and they went out on 2 local fishing boats. And they was out there probably an hour before we got there on the Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard had to come from Shag Harbour.
Oh, so you actually got on the boat?
I got on the Coast Guard boat, me and one of the RCMP officers, I don't know which one, and went out on the Coast Guard that night. I think one of the other RCMP officers was aboard one of the fishing boats, but I'm not sure.
Okay. And how old were you when this happened?
17. I would have been 18 at the end of the month.
So that's that clip. There was a longer version, but I clipped off a lot at the end. That was that piece that I just played is exactly what appeared on my show.
Boy, does he ever sound like some of the people in Maine, a real Mainer. Now, in your area, isn't there? Am I getting this wrong? Aren't there a lot of French-speaking?
Yeah,
people?
we do have a lot of French-speaking people, a lot of Acadians. But yeah, where this happened in Shag Harbour, you said near Maine. This is very close to Maine because it's the southwestern tip of Nova Scotia. So just across the mouth of the Bay of Fundy would be Maine.
And there are we're going to talk a little bit later. A Prince Edward Island sighting, which is right in that area, and I've been there a number of times myself. It's real beautiful there. I know last night in our failed show, it sounded like you were talking through a soup can, describing Shag Harbour, and it's just had to do with me holding the speakerphone. So I want for the listener that that was a great account of what we just heard from an actual witness, which is really fantastic. But the whole story is such an incredible one. It's one of the more documented, sightings. Can you kind of go into the Shag Harbour incident for perhaps someone is just not familiar with it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll give the most basic rundown of it, because at its essence and its most, with just talking about the most basic facts, it stands on its own. I find a lot of other sightings, it gets very technical and complicated, but with Shag Harbour, it's very simple and very effective because of that. So basically, as you just heard Laurie Wickens describe, it was him and 3 others in the car with him. They were all about 18 years old, and they're just driving down a very rural street in the Shag Harbour area. And just above the tree line, they had noticed 4 lights parallel with each other, blinking slowly on and off, traveling at about the same speed as their vehicle. And their first thought was it was the lights on the wings of a jet or of an airliner. So they were driving, seeing the lights, and their first reaction was, it's odd that this plane is so low to the ground. But as they kind of made the twists and the turns through the street, they got at a vantage point where they could see the lights come over the tree line, cross the street and descending towards the they call it the Sound, which is the actual water that Shag Harbour is named from. And as they're driving on the waterfront, they saw the lights. They could hear the sound kind of like of a bomb, like pew! And then they heard a loud kind of bang splash, and they watched the lights descend into the water, a good way away from the shore. So they didn't see a splash or anything. They just saw the lights descend into the water. So right away they panic, thinking they just watched probably a passenger plane crash into the water. So what they did was they drove just past the Sound to I think it was a gas station that had a payphone in front of it. And Laurie Wickens, who you just heard, he described this, but he called to report what he believed to be a downed aircraft. The person at the RCMP who answered the call asked him, have you been drinking? And he assured them, like, no, this is, I'm with my friends. We just saw it happen. The person who was on the phone answering the call didn't seem to take them very seriously, but almost immediately after, other calls started to come through. I believe there was about 11 reports of almost the exact same thing within a matter of a minute or two. And this is people from the neighboring homes that watched the lights descend into the water, reporting it. And at that point, the RCMP took them very seriously, asked Laurie Wickens to go back to the shoreline where they would send RCMP to meet with him, and he could show them, where he saw the plane land. So when he went back to the shoreline, this is just probably 10 minutes after he saw it descend into the water, he was met by 11 RCMP officers. When they all arrived there, they were looking out into the water. Again, it's Laurie, 3 or 4 of his friends, 11 RCMP officers, and now some people from the neighboring homes are starting to come down to the shoreline as well who had seen it. So very quickly, a crowd is starting to gather. And what they all see out in the water is a pale yellow light that seems to have kind of a dome-shaped, a good ways out. Their initial thought is that this is the plane probably slowly sinking. So they're looking out at it thinking, there's likely a whole bunch of people out there fighting for their life, splashing around in the water. We got to get out there. So the RCMP, they call the Coast Guard and ask them to send a boat up. But taking matters into their own hands, Laurie Wickens and many of the people in Shag Harbour, it's a small fishing community, so they own fishing boats. So they start building a team, getting on the fishing boats to start going out to the pale yellow light, because at this point they were watching the light get dimmer and dimmer, again assuming that the plane is sinking into the water. So they're in panic mode. So they get on the boats to start to get out to the lights to save whoever they could save. But by the time they got out there, and at this point they were met by a Coast Guard vessel as well, and there's RCMP officers on these boats as well as fishermen. When they get out to where the yellow light was, the light is now gone. There's no sign of debris or people. Instead, what they found was a thick yellow foam over the water in one patch near where the yellow light was seen. And when you hear of this yellow foam, people often will think of sea foam, which would be common in the area, which is just like the scum that will look like soap on top of the salty water. But this was described by Laurie as something completely different. He said it was thick, almost like if you, the way he told me is like if he took a butter knife and hung it off the side of the boat, he could have scooped some up and spread it thick over bread. Not the consistency of peanut butter, but getting there sort of thing. So that's what they found when they arrived out to the water. No debris or no nothing. So now they're thinking, the boat must have sunk, or the airplane must have sunk to the bottom of the water. What they ended up doing from there is they all get back to the shoreline. The Coast Guard has plans for when the light comes up, they're going to send divers down. The next morning, the search continues. There's now, I think three divers the next morning, and they're diving every day for the next 3 days. It was pretty quickly determined that there were no missing planes. The next morning, they had determined that all planes were accounted for. So nobody really knew what they had found. But for 3 days, they dove. The official explanation, or the official story, is that they had never found anything, although you will find some reports that people had seen stuff being pulled out of the water and carted away in trucks, but I have never encountered anyone who would tell me that. And most people who are investigating that don't take those reports very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So that is Shag Harbour in a nutshell.
Okay, now this was on sonar at some point.
Mm-hmm. That is, and this is also like any great story. There's lots of moving parts and different versions, but the idea of people talk about the USO and that there were things underwater being tracked moving around. That is, I think a lot of that came from Chris Stiles' investigation, where he was pulling so many government documents. But I think a lot of it came from reading between the lines of things that were said in these documents. I hadn't seen anything that was absolutely black and white saying that things were seen and tracked under the water with sonar. But there was some unusual activity that people believe may have been some type of craft moving around. But I was when I looked into the story, I was trying to stick with the things that could be corroborated by a group of people, or at least one person who was holding strong with one story. And I couldn't find anyone who convinced me that things were tracked underwater. And the same goes with what you may ask about is the idea that a week after the event, people believe the story is that people had seen something leave the water and descend into the sky. And that's kind of a cool story. What ended up happening was a week after the event. So it happened October 4th. It was October 11th. A guy who lives right on the waterfront there, he had seen, I believe he had seen it crash into the water a week prior. He was watching TV and he started to get a lot of interference on his TV. So he went outside to look at his satellite dish and his antenna. When he was adjusting it, he heard something behind him, a strange noise. And when he looked behind, he said he saw a series of lights leave the water and just quickly ascend into the sky behind the cloud cover. And that's where that story comes from, that people had seen an object leave the water a week later. But I've never interviewed this person. I tried to get in touch with him unsuccessfully, and I don't know how public he is or how interested he was with sharing the story as that report started to circulate. But some of the ufologists that I spoke to that are researching it didn't seem to take it very seriously, and without actually doing so, sort of rolled their eyes when that came up. So I don't believe that's taken too seriously by the people who are really, really working on this.
So when you were like doing a show on this list, to say, did you just were really careful not to cross any lines unless you had something that was really factual, which, I appreciate that. That's good. So one of the questions we had pop up in the chat room, and we can go back to Shag Harbour, but someone wanted to know if you ever actually had a sighting yourself.
Yeah, I did, and I'm embarrassed to say it's pretty unremarkable, but to me it was powerful. This occurred when I was I think I was about 6 years old, and in true Canadian fashion, it was myself, my older brother, and a lot of the neighborhood kids. I lived on a small dead-end street, and the street was kind of cut into a pretty steep embankment. So all the homes were on this hill, and it was a dead-end street cut into the hill. All the houses speckled it. And when it was, all the homes were built around the same time, so every family was kind of the same age. So pretty much every house had like a kid my older brother's age and a kid my age. So we had a lot of games of hide and seek and all that, where there was only like 20 houses, but there was like 40 kids, sort of thing. But anyway, our street was on a hill. There was a really good area where we would slide when there's a lot of snow. You get on like the toboggans and stuff, and we'd slide down. And it was a weeknight, because I know I had school the next day, and the sun had set. It was now nighttime. We're all sliding down the hill, and I remember myself and my brother were at the bottom of the hill collecting our toboggans, starting to make our way back up the hill, when it's so hard to explain, but it was like you could kind of hear it, but it was just a really low tone that just seemed to like I could almost feel it in my bones rather than hear it in my ears. And I heard the sound, and I remember just stopping dead in my tracks and like looking at my older brother like, what was that? And then all of a sudden it went from nighttime to like brighter than daytime. The entire area was lit up like, like brighter than daylight. And I remember then kind of looking up to see, I'm expecting like a helicopter with a spotlight pointed, directly into my eye. But instead, I remember just a massive bright light above us. The whole area lit up, and it felt like I was frozen in time, because I can remember all the other kids, I could kind of reacting the same way, looking up and just being shocked. And then all of a sudden, that low tone that was kind of rumbling and caught my attention initially. It kind of like, it was like an explosion, but not a loud explosion. It was just almost like a really low vacuum, sort of just for a second, and it was just gone. And the light above us that was lighting up the whole area extinguished. And then it was just chaos. I remember the kids, like the younger ones that were like my age, all are like crying and running up the hill. And all the older kids are kind of like collect us and, get everybody out of there. And we all ran home and told our parents what happened. And everybody the parents, I think, kind of laughed about it. And it was, for the most part, forgotten, except all the kids on the street randomly when we meet up, because we're much older now, but randomly it'll come up. And in fact, through my podcast, I heard a lot of people from my neighborhood email me and stuff asking me, are you ever going to talk about the UFO we all seen? I never will, because it happened so long ago and there's nothing really to talk about other than the story. But that happened to me, and people will make fun of me when I bring it up, but it happened, and it was unusual. I don't know what it could have been. I don't know if it was an alien spacecraft or some freak type of lightning or something, but it was a clear night. I can almost remember the stars and stuff, so I have no explanation for what we saw.
Well, to me, it sounds a little bit more remarkable than it sounds like a pretty interesting sighting to me. We have some questions that came in from the forum. And someone wanted to know, let's see. Yep, I have the wrong page here. Bell Island boom. What can you tell us about the Bell Island boom in 1978?
Yeah, that's a really cool story. And people who are into it, it's not entirely linked with UFOs and ufology, but anyone who doesn't know this story, it's pretty crazy. So Bell Island's a small island in Newfoundland, which is on eastern Canada, very close to where I am in Nova Scotia. And basically the Bell Island boom is what they call it. It was an unexplained aerial event, an aerial explosion in the sky that left a bizarre field of damage on this one particular area. No one has ever explained what had happened, but every single detail of this story is unusual, and it's all confirmed because there's photos of it. Even the most unusual parts of it, there's photos and proof and evidence of it. So basically, I just gave you the most basic story there. It was a quiet day. I think it was a Sunday around 11 o'clock in the morning, if I recall. What the people had seen was it started with a sulfuric smell. The sky kind of had a rusty color to it. Then the massive boom happened, and basically in a matter of it lasted about 15 to 35 seconds is what people had described. And what it ended up doing was leaving a lot of strange electrical damage. The ground zero, so to speak, of the boom is this, they call it the Bickford farm. The family's last name is Bickford. And on their farm seemed to be where most of the damage occurred. The elder Bickford, when the boom sounded, he went outside. This is during the Cold War. He's expecting to see bombs falling from the sky. Instead, what he saw was two massive kind of cone-shaped holes in his front lawn where it looked like the dirt just jumped out of the holes. So he saw those. He could smell the sulfuric smell. He noticed his chicken coop was knocked over. His chicken coop's like the building he kept his chickens in. He went over there, and all his chickens were dead with blood coming out of their eyes, and there's photos of this. Wow. Then as he's reacting to that, his younger son, who I had been emailing back and forth with during my research, his son came in the driveway bawling his eyes out. And his son's story was he was driving his bike, and just prior to the boom, he said he saw a massive bright orb just floating in the sky that he described as being like, you know what, like a toy sparkler is, where you light it and it's just big. Psh.
Yeah.
He said it was like that, except it was like the size of much bigger than any type of ball for a sport, like, you know, like 5 times of a baseball or something, like something that if you held it, you would have your arm stretched out holding it. He said it just hovered in front of his bike, and then when the boom blasted, it disappeared and he fell off his bike. So yeah, that's some of what happened. And one other thing that's very certifiable and absolutely true is the fire marshal. This was this one guy on Bell Island who would investigate any type of fire. He had done an investigation on the Bickford farm, and he took photos and shared all his information. And he was looking at a lot of the electrical damage. And what was really cool that he found was the power lines that led from the Bickford farm and connected electricity from the street or whatever. The insulation on the wires was just basically dust on the ground. The wires heated up so hot that the plastic or rubber insulation on them just crystallized and fell to the ground. Also, the entire home had to be rewired. Basically, anything electric in the house had to be replaced. Even homes, streets away, their TVs had exploded. One man was sitting down at the kitchen table having breakfast when on the wall, one of the power outlets that you'd plug things into, it was just like a blowtorch spraying out of it. He said about 12 inches out of the outlet was just a hot blue flame. He had to have his wiring replaced. So there was just bizarre stuff on that entire island.
Now, what was some of the prosaic, explanations for what happened?
Well, there's a few. So the official government explanation is that it was some type of rare supercharged ball lightning. That is the official government explanation. However, meteorologists and people who study weather patterns say that that's impossible and that the atmosphere wasn't conducive to super bolts or this rare type of super ball lightning. So there's a bit of a debate there, but that's what the Canadian government still holds true. There is one other thing that was going on at the time that a lot of people think may have been involved, and that is the Concorde jet was just starting here, and it was creating sonic booms as it was breaking the sound barrier. What they were doing with the flight path of the Concorde jet is they were moving it. They moved it on the Eastern Seaboard of the U.S. What was happening where there was reports of these sonic booms, just loud bangs coming from the sky. People were complaining to the people who deal with, flight paths of airplanes. So they started moving the flight paths further out to sea, which would have brought them kind of in line with Bell Island. And these sonic booms were going on for about a year leading up to the Bell Island boom. When they moved the flight path of the Concorde further out to sea, it seemed to stop the sonic booms, and the problem for the most part went away. But none of these sonic booms had any type of power like what happened on Bell Island. One thing, though, that also relates it to the Concorde jet is when these sonic booms were happening, people described seeing orbs of sparks or of just bright lights appearing in the sky, even during the night and during the day. So some people do think that whatever was going on in the year leading up to the Bell Island boom and the Eastern Seaboard of the States may be related to the Bell Island boom.
Anything happened after that?
There was some strange investigation into it that led a lot of people wondering. There was a Canadian military on site in the days after. There was American military on site. There was Soviet military on site. And then there was, and this will come up anytime you read anything about the Bell Island boom. You're going to read about 2 researchers from Los Alamos visiting. Some people think that didn't happen. It absolutely happened, and you can even watch video of them on YouTube because CBC did a documentary. CBC is our Canadian Broadcast Corporation, like the Canadian version of the BBC. But the CBC did a documentary about it. And they're filmed there. They're seen online on there. They were there asking some questions to the fire marshal, to the Bickfords. And what was really unusual about these two guys from Los Alamos is they wouldn't talk to each other in front of people. So if they were interviewing you, Martin, one of them would ask you a question, and you'd answer the question. The other guy would write it down, and then they would either cover their mouths and kind of whisper to each other, or one would write on the paper and show it to the other guy. So they would never talk verbally to each other. They would just ask a question, write down, and then, sneakily talk back and forth. So that set a lot of people, that made a lot of people wonder what their intentions there were.
Right. I know you cover, mostly the Eastern Seaboard area, but have you ever looked into the Carp Guardian case at all?
Never have. No, I know the name, but I don't know the details of the case. But someday, hopefully, I will.
How about other famous Canadian cases?
Well, I won't say this is a famous Canadian case, but it's been covered in the news quite a bit. Is and I think you alluded to it earlier. It was a sighting in PEI, which Prince Edward Island, which is another eastern province very near me. There was an interesting sighting there where a guy he was camping on a campground, and he put out the bonfire. His wife was asleep in the tent, and he saw an odd light in the sky, and he just watched it for a minute. And then it just got odder and odder. It seemed to be moving around and getting brighter and darker. So he started filming it with his cell phone. And I think he filmed it for about a half hour. And as he's watching it, he was a couple minutes into it, he was pretty convinced that he was seeing something really special. What he ended up doing was reported it to MUFON, sent them the video. MUFON did their investigation and ended up deeming it a certifiable, unidentified object. Like, they could find no explanation. So what ended up happening was the CBC, again, they put out an article basically summarizing the details of the event. They included a link to the video, which is very cool to watch. And then they talked about MUFON's investigation and the fact that MUFON deemed it an unidentified flying object. What ended up happening is the next day, when the story airs online and in the papers and on the radio or whatnot, the skeptics just came out of the woodwork, and everybody, all the different expertises, they all had a different explanation as to what he saw. And it just started this little UFO researcher versus skeptic battle that just kind of waged in the papers for a couple of days. You can find links to it if you just Googled like Kensington, which is the name of the town, or PEI UFO. You'll find the various articles. And this guy who filmed it, he's not like a guy who's into UFOs or anything. He's just a regular guy. He ended up reporting it to MUFON. I think what he had told me was he was just Googling who I could report this to, and found the MUFON's website where you can report an unidentified object. And he said, what the hell, I'll do it. But anyway, he found himself in the middle of this battle. People attacking him personally, attacking his credibility, the skeptics attacking the researchers, and vice versa. So that was when I get into UFO stories, I don't like to get into the really complicated fringe stuff. I like to stick with the basics, and especially get involved with like the human element. That's why Shag Harbour is so compelling, because there's so many witnesses and they're all so interesting. This here story in Kensington that I just mentioned, I thought this was great because the guy in the middle of it, his name's John Shepard. He's just a complete everyman who has just kind of found himself just dropped in this bizarre world that he was not ready for, which was the ufologists versus the skeptics, with the media reporting on the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you know a Scott from Cape Breton? He's saying hi to you in the message board.
Oh, yeah, he has my papers. Scott is...
Yeah, he said that.
Oh, yeah. Scott, and I want him to collect the ones from the other day, too, if you can get any from the 14th, Scott. Scott is from my hometown, and he works at the local... I think he works for the local newspaper, so he collected some papers from a story they did on my podcast not too long ago.
Oh, that's funny. I watched the video of the Prince Edward Island sighting you're talking about. I guess it was 2014. Not super remarkable, but it was taken with an iPhone, which I've tried to film some things with an iPhone. It doesn't really give it too much justice,
Yeah, when I watched the video, it's not the image that I found interesting. It was more so his narration, because all you see is a black screen with a white dot, but you can hear him talking throughout it, and he's talking to himself about what it could be. He's describing it and in better detail than what you see. So I thought it was a really cool story.
Right. I have spoken to people that work with images, UFO images, from MUFON, and Mark D'Antonio and Bruce. Oh my God, I just lost his name. But anyway, they say the witnesses are the most, are the key part of the whole situation. Without good witnesses, images, it's another light in the sky, so to speak.
Exactly. And when you look at photos of UFOs, it's often at night. It's black with a white dot. But if you want to know how hard it would be to film a UFO and get a good picture, just pick some clear night when the moon's out and take your iPhone out and just try to take a picture of the moon, and look how terrible that looks. It's impossible to, with a regular camera or an iPhone or whatever, to get a good shot of a small bright light in a night sky. You would need, very professional equipment. So I leave it to the witness to tell me their story, because I'm more interested in that than the photograph, 9 times out of 10.
Right. Going back to Shag Harbour, there's a question up on the message board. Has anyone ever done a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request to the U.S. Navy on Shag Harbour? Because I know the U.S. Navy was involved in that.
They were. There's a lot of different theories as what could have went on in Shag Harbour, and a lot of them involve the U.S. and the U.S. government doing spying on the Soviets or the Russians or whoever at the time. But as far as Freedom of Information Act requests, the lead ufologist who's working on this, his name is Chris Stiles. I'm going to hold up 2 of his books here. He wrote 2 books on it so far. One is called Impact to Contact. The other one is called Dark Object. Both of these books are incredible, but this guy, when people talk about Shag Harbour, they're talking about the details that Chris Stiles put together, because up until the 90s, when he joined MUFON as a field investigator, he had to pick a sighting, and he decided for whatever reason to go after Shag Harbour. At this point, it was just one of a million little sightings that people didn't care too much about. This one had a couple articles about it in the paper years prior, but that was about it. But he ended up pursuing every avenue. He was contacting the witnesses. He was doing Freedom of Information Acts, getting as much information as he could. He would have gone. I'm surprised he probably showed up at the American government's office with a baseball bat demanding papers. Like, this guy is a dog-nosed kind of reporter. When I interviewed him for my show, I went to his house, and it was exactly what you would expect, like a really intense ufologist's host to be, UFO researcher's host to be. So I first go in, and it had this air of secrecy, like it was really complicated to get the opportunity to interview him. And you won't see Chris Stiles do a lot of appearances either. But anyway, I had a hard time getting in touch with him, a hard time convincing him to let me interview him. When I showed up at his house, it was a small little place that had everywhere you looked was UFO, either books or documents. He had one room that was just like filing cabinets, and it's all Shag Harbour related. But everywhere you looked, there was big stacks of paper that he collected over the years and was organizing relating to Shag Harbour. So it was pretty intense, but it was really exciting. When I was there, it would be the kind of place I'd like to spend a weekend at his house and just flip through those papers.
Right. Did he ever investigate anything else, or was it just that?
Well, the other sightings that he spent the most time with are ones that he feels relates to Shag Harbour. So he did a lot of work with Bell Island, the Bell Island boom, but more so it was sightings that he believes may have had some relevance to Shag Harbour, because leading up to the Shag Harbour UFO incident, this was really the climax of a flap that was going on in Atlantic, Canada, in the months leading up to the event. It seemed to start, I think about 3 months prior, there was an increase of sightings. but it kept getting the frequency was getting higher and higher, including the severity. They were getting to be more unusual more often. The days leading up to the Shag Harbour incident, it was all over the place in Atlantic Canada. And then the night of the Shag Harbour incident, some people call it the night of the UFOs, because all across Nova Scotia there were sightings of UFOs. It was just the one in Shag Harbour was the one that had the most evidence around it and the most people had seen it. But there was reports all over the place that night. So he's been researching a lot of them. And that's what he spends the most of his time on. In fact, when I had spoke to him last, he's been working on this again since the early 90s. When I spoke to him last about 3 or 4 months ago, he was telling me he's like working on some pretty intense stuff, and he agreed he was going to share it to me once he was ready to share it publicly. But I don't know what he's working on, but he's still digging into it. Yeah.
You know, you mentioned earlier that Shag Harbour wasn't that far away from the States, you know, the state of Maine. And, of course, UFOs know no borders. So have some of the sightings, like, crossed from you know, Canada into the States that you're aware of?
Oh, yeah. And often, like where I am in Eastern Canada, oftentimes there's sightings that will span multiple provinces, including going into the States. I can't think of any top of my head. And
yeah, well, there was one. Well, there was one with a radar of over 20,000 miles an hour, if I remember right, that crossed over from the eastern shores over and through Canada.
And now that I'm thinking of it, Kecksburg, I think there was. When that occurred, people there was reports from Canada. I'm not sure what may have been Ontario or Quebec, but there were reports of people witnessing whatever happened in Kecksburg through Canada.
Right, that's right. Yeah, there was a little. Yeah, go ahead.
And I should say, speaking of Kecksburg, there's a podcast I listen to all the time called Astonishing Legends. They just did an episode on Kecksburg, and they spoke very highly of your show. There was I think you did an episode where you had 2 experts debating it.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, and they spoke about that several times to the show.
Wow. Yeah, that was John Ventry and Stan Gordon.
Okay.
You know, Stan Gordon has been on that case right from the beginning, you know, way back when he was a kid, basically, and he saw it in the papers, and that's what actually got him into the UFO field. So he's been following. John Ventry has his idea that it was something man-made, something that, you know, came through the atmosphere and crashed. But Stan's not really buying it. Yeah, it's interesting to hear. As you know, on this topic, it's always interesting to hear different people's points of view, for sure.
It's that's what's so interesting about the UFO phenomenon. That's the details often are so vague that it leaves so much up for interpretation that it's, you know, it's almost like if you have a great imagination, an eye for research, and a mind for a good story, it's just like the ultimate playground, because there's so many ways you can take it.
Yeah, someone just commented in the message board that there's no static on my I have it costs a lot of money. I have the same microphone you have, and I have a whole audio setup, and now I'm on a cheap $45 headset, and by golly, it sounds good and there's no static. That's all I'm concerned about. Someone wanted to know through the forum, they had a question. Seeing as you cover a wide range of genres, paranormal, true crime, etc., do you ever run into any parallels between the UFO stories and other stories that you cover?
Yeah, well, I have the Bell Island boom one definitely connected with a lot of the other UFO sightings. People have an opinion that what happened on Bell Island could possibly have been a UFO in some way. It's for me, I'm covering Atlantic Canadian topics, so everything that I'm covering kind of happens in the same kind of proximity. So even people I keep bringing him up, but here's just a crazy story that it shows how small the world is. So I talked about Chris Stiles. He's the lead researcher for Shag Harbour. I had interviewed him for my Shag Harbour episode. in addition to UFOs, I often cover true crime and missing persons and unexplained events. But I was doing an episode about there was this guy who I had got in touch with, and he was investigating his grandfather's unexplained death that he believed was a hit from the government. His grandfather was living on a military base that did a lot of storage and research with Agent Orange back in the 60s. I guess that was a drug or a chemical used in, I think, the Vietnam War.
Right.
Anyway,
Defoliate.
Yes, exactly. His grandfather died under very mysterious circumstances. It involved his grandfather being beaten by somebody that they had never found. When his granddad was in the hospital, it was a military hospital. A nurse walked in on the doctor, who was a captain in the military, was choking his grandfather, and she had to separate him. And the doctor was arrested and actually lost his license. Then when he was in an ambulance going from that hospital to another hospital, that ambulance got hit by a train. He was injured in the train accident and ended up dying in the hospital. But anyway, my guest was trying to figure out, what happened to his grandfather and how this all could have went down. He had a lot of documents that his grandparents had stored because they had tried to sue the federal government. We were going through the documents together, and a lot of the documents kept talking about, and this guy's grandparents his grandmother's dead now, and that's why we couldn't talk to her about it. But a lot of the documents were the grandmother suing the government looking for like a widow's pension, and they were all signed by a C. Stiles. And then on a few documents, we started to see the name written out, Chris Stiles. And I said to my guest, I'm like, it's funny that this name keeps popping up because, in the months past, I did a UFO episode about where my guest was a Chris Stiles. And the guy my guest on the episode, who was investigating his granddad's mysterious death, he said, that's funny that you mentioned that because I remember my uncle talking about a friend that researched UFOs. So I was thinking, maybe it's the same Chris Stiles. So I had emailed him, and what he told me was in his younger days, he was actually working as a paralegal and ended up representing the grandmother in her lawsuit against the government. But it was just an absolute freak coincidence that happened. But he ended up giving me a lot of good information because he knew a lot more about the story than my guest did. So yes, I do see parallels.
Right. Another question came in just today on the message board. And what is your view of the former Canadian Defense Minister Paul Hellyer and his accusations that world leaders are concealing the presence of aliens?
Yeah, I don't know what I think about it. I feel the same. I think I feel the same way about that as I do about like any kind of 9/11 conspiracy theories or anything. I just don't think the government has it together enough to be able to keep something secret long enough. And I know some people may say they're not like the post office or something. If the government had a secret they wanted to keep, they'd be able to keep it. I just don't know if they could keep a secret that big. So I take it with a grain of salt, I think. It just seems very, like a plot element from X-Files, maybe too much for me. I think there's definitely something unusual happening in our skies. Too many people are seeing it with too many similarities, but I don't know if the government's interested in it as some people may think they are. So I don't take it very seriously.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you when you say that about the government, because maybe they have not a clue like we do, the same thing as we do. They may know nothing. It's possible, but they're not going to make a big deal about it because if something is flying around our skies and they know about it, they can't do anything about it. So I think that's the reason for these studies, Project Blue Book, closing, all that, just try to calm people down, the Robertson panel, try to ridicule and all that. It's just because there's a control issue, there is no control over what is happening. I was trying to get James Fox. I was texting him. He's out at the Phoenix event. I was trying to get him on the show earlier. I didn't, he just can't do it, unfortunately. But he's out there to do a talk about the Phoenix Lights, and there's a question that came in to you from the forum, and it says, with the 20th anniversary of the Phoenix Lights if this event happened in present day with the advancement of personal technology and social media, live streaming, etc., would this force the government to admit that we're being visited by something not from Earth? What's your opinion? What's your opinion on that scenario? That's the question.
Well, I think that's what it's going to take is social media and, and somebody getting the right picture or the right video and being in the right spot at the right time. So whether it's the Phoenix Lights or any of these historical events, if somebody was standing there with an iPhone, and getting great footage, especially if there's multiple people, and that started getting shared and going viral and it's on Reddit and Twitter and all that stuff, if enough people band together and had strong enough evidence, something would happen. I'm convinced. But as it stands right now, the people involved in discussing and talking about UFOs, in the grand scheme of things, we're such a small number of people that we could never, push the government to do any one thing without something that was really effective, and that would have to be a great piece of video or a great photo, not this grainy thing that you see, or it would have to be something really compelling, and it doesn't exist at this point. But I think people in the field investigators with MUFON, every report that comes to them, they react thinking, this could be the smoking gun that changes everything. Mm. And I think it may happen, and it may just be, who knows, maybe some little old lady walking down the street will just see the right thing, and she'll manage to get her phone out quick enough and get it set to the camera to get that photo or that video that, that changes the world. And I think it will happen someday, and I hope I'm alive to see it.
Yeah, I've said that before too, and I'm not really sure if a photo or a video or I'm not really sure if that would be enough. I mean, there's the naysayers, the skeptics, and I understand, everyone should be skeptical over, to really look at something very clearly. But I remember asking Seth Shostak from SETI, I said, what would you need to know that, what would you need for evidence that they're actually visiting Earth? And he said a wing full of UFOs in the Smithsonian. So I mean, everyone has a different take, but even if the President of the United States or the Queen of England said we are being visited, there's still going to be the naysayers. I think it's going to be a really hard thing, but I think it's going to be easier today than it was 20, 30 years ago with all the or close evidence that there's Earth-like planets out there and the possibilities of life on billions of planets just in our galaxy. I think it'll be an easier pill to swallow, but there's always going to be the people that are the naysayers, that are going to look for holes to punch through, whatever the evidence is, I think.
Yeah, and I think for anyone out there who doesn't believe, that there's life outside of Earth, I would think it would be much more fantastic for there not to be life elsewhere than for there to be. It's just the question I often struggle with is why would they want to come here, and if they did come here, why would they be why would we see them? Like, you would think if they can travel that far and make it here. For one, when I think of, say, Roswell and Shag Harbour, if they did get all the way here, what are the chances that they would just arrive and crash? But also, when you hear reports of large ships, that kind of troubles me, because when I just think of humans, when we're exploring, let's say going to Mars, we don't take a big machine and get over there. We send like a small rover to do, scientific, precise little things. And in 100 years' time, if we send something to Mars, it'd be even smaller than the rover, and you may not even be able to detect it unless you're standing right on top of it. So I think about that, of if there were other life forms coming here to study us or watch us or whatnot, they probably wouldn't crash, and they probably wouldn't need to be in a large object to watch us. And I think it would be unlikely that they would actually send beings here. But that's just my 2 cents.
No. I understand. It reminds me early what you just said, or we were talking about Arthur C. Clarke. His saying is two possibilities exist. Either we are alone in the universe or we are not. Both are equally terrifying. I always love that one.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So let's go back. A few people in the message board are talking about the Phoenix Lights, and that anniversary is coming up, just in a couple of days, March 13th, 2007. So that'll be the 10th, the 10th anniversary? Was it 2007? I hope I'm getting this right.
I think it was 97. Uh-oh. Quick,
I think you're
Google
right.
it.
You are absolutely right. It was 1997. Boy, am I I'm only off a couple of decades.
Yeah. It gives fodder for the people in the chat room to bash us.
That's right. Yeah. All right. I can take it. So that is interesting. I mean, that would almost seem like one that would crack what we were talking about earlier, is the admittance that we are being visited. When Governor Fife Symington, I mentioned that to. I did some type of debate on the show. I can't remember with skeptics. I can't remember the name of the show. It's a skeptic show, a podcast, and I debated Evan and I can't Epstein or something like that. I wish I could get the name right. Anyway, when we did kind of a UFO debate, and I mentioned the Phoenix Lights, and I mentioned Governor Fife Symington, and he said, "Have you seen that he has a criminal record? How could you possibly believe him?" And I don't even know if that's true or not. But that's something, maybe slanderous that he said. But anyway, an interesting thing. A governor of the state of Arizona sees this thing, and finally admits it. And it's still, talking about James Fox earlier, it's in his film when he talks about it. But it still hasn't, really moved the needle too much on, people, actually taking a real hard look at this.
Yeah, and I think it's with what may change it is especially with these mass sightings where there's so many people there, especially if it goes on for a period of time, is a massive viral movement. So something like the Phoenix Lights or Shag Harbour, and people putting it up online, getting other people talking, and getting the mainstream to pay attention to it. So I'm always excited when I see UFO sighting in the news, because I like to read the comments and see how the average person who's not out there looking for these stories reacts. But if it was something that was compelling enough and had everybody on Facebook and Twitter talking, and then it got people who weren't into the phenomenon talking, maybe then it would force the hand of the government or the powers that be. And maybe they won't go, maybe it wouldn't move it as far as them to admit that, we're being visited or whatever, but maybe it could force them to say even something like, there's a lot of things happening in the sky that we can't explain. And maybe that's, the straw or the little ball that starts rolling down the hill that's slowly going to gain speed and gain mass over the years. So I think we just need, in this day and age, we need a really compelling sighting that a lot of people see and take to social media to talk about.
Right. And, someone mentioned in the message board they think the ball is rolling. And I think, they possibly are right about that. It just seems, it's more and more acceptable that, but whether it's acceptable that we're being visited, that's the part that's the tough one for people to actually, wrap their heads around.
Mm-hmm. Especially for the average layman who's not into that. Like people who are listening to this show right now, they're open to the idea and they know these stories. But if we just went to the local coffee shop and just sat down at a table with four strangers, they would likely have a completely different perspective than anybody listening to this show. And so what needs to happen is something that makes those people that are randomly sitting at a coffee shop, makes them think about it and consider it. And maybe even tell a friend about it.
There is you're right, it's a very, very small percentage of people actually are not looking at their iPhone and, involved in daily life and involved in, getting by and not really thinking too much about this. But there are a lot of people that, really love the sciences that also think, hey, this could happen. I mentioned, I think it was just last week that my brother-in-law was, a scientist at Los Alamos for many years, and I was afraid to tell him that I did, the show on UFOs, and he took it really well. He said, "Yeah, it could be. They could be here." And so there are some people that are open, and science, science should be open because things change. New evidence comes along, and no one should get stuck in a paradigm of science, true science. I don't think.
Just going to address. I think there's probably a bit of lag, but I see in the chat room somebody's asking about the elephant in the room, asked about the 1978 Clarenville, Newfoundland and Labrador sighting with Constable Jim Vickford. Yes, I do have info on that, and that's something that's actually the event that I'm working on right now, is researching what had happened in Clarenville, Newfoundland in '78. So I just saw somebody in the room there asked if I had any info on the sighting, but I don't have enough to tell the whole story now, but that's definitely the sighting I'm working on now.
Well, how about a little teaser? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, well, basically it's in Newfoundland, a small town called Clarenville. What's interesting about it is the sighting was by a local RCMP, or a police officer named Jim Blackwood. He for about 15 minutes he saw an object in the sky. He looked at it through binoculars because he had a pair of binoculars on him in his cruiser, I believe. He watched it for a while. He drew pictures and shared them. He didn't take any photographs because he didn't have a camera. But he ended up speaking to the press about it, and the media, for the most part, had a field day with him. And he was kind of ridiculed in the papers. There's a video going around. If you Googled, Jim Blackwood UFO or Clarenville UFO, you'll see a video of him shortly after the incident, sitting down at a press conference in front of the media, describing what he saw and answering questions about it. But nobody really took him seriously. But a lot of people started to take him seriously last year when somebody in that same area saw something very similar and reported it and was picked up by the press. So now there's two fairly compelling sightings from this same area with some common characteristics.
Now, I remember, I remember being to PEI, Prince Edward Island, and there was Magnetic Hill.
Yeah,
I just remember
that's
that
in
when I was
New
a little
Brunswick.
kid.
Yeah.
Oh,
that's
that's
very close. You probably pass through New Brunswick on the way. But yeah, Magnetic Hills. When you're on a hill, you park your car, you put your car in neutral, and your car will roll up the hill.
That's right. I remember that
bizarre.
being. I couldn't believe that. I was like 4 or 5 years old at the time. Someone wants to know what's your favorite case. I'm gonna guess it's Shag Harbour, but is it something else?
Well, I would have to say my grandparents' 86 Monroe's Point sighting. That's the one that's the most personal because it's been with me my whole life. But overall, it's the Shag Harbour sighting because to me, it's so many people were there. They were from the area. They know the sky there. A lot of them were fishermen. They know what's normal in the water. There was RCMP on site. The Canadian Coast Guard was there. Since it was reported as an airplane crashing, the government investigated it as if it was an airplane crashing. So this is all documented. Shag Harbour definitely is the case that I think is the most compelling of any I've ever heard. Whether it was a UFO or what, I don't know, but there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that there was something bizarre in the sky and it landed in the water. And I don't know what it could be. Your guess is as good as mine. There's a million theories about it, but there's no doubt in my mind something really unique and unusual happened that night, and a lot of people saw it.
Someone wants to know how can you justify the government not knowing more than us with such projects as gun camera investigations in the Arctic?
I have no idea what that is, but every time I deal with the government, they screw it up and drive me crazy. So I think if there's some massive secret like proof of UFO life or a massive conspiracy like 9/11 or something like that some people suspect, I think there's going to be some guy or girl involved in organizing it or working on it that's just going to make a big mistake or going to talk like a deathbed confession or something. I think it would eventually get out. I just can't believe it. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. not that I'm skeptical. I just don't believe the government could get away with it. It would take to cover it up and manage it. It would take so many people that somebody would make a mistake.
Yeah, you would think so. I talked to Stan Friedman about this one time, and he said, well, something like 45,000 people knew about the atomic bomb, with the Manhattan Project. I don't know if it was actually 45,000, but a lot of people did, and they kept it secret. Maybe it is possible.
Oh yeah, anything is possible, and I'm not saying that isn't happening. I have a hard time considering it.
Let's see. There was someone just asked a pretty good question. Oh yes, is there any other documentaries on Shag Harbour coming out that you know of, or if not, is there a really good one, up on YouTube or something like that someone can find that can watch that?
Yeah, there's a lot coming. Well, I'll answer it as two separate questions. There's a lot coming about Shag Harbour because it's the 50th anniversary is coming up this October. So you're going to find a lot of stuff about Shag Harbour when that happens. For documentaries, there's two really good ones on YouTube. My favorite one is Don Ledger and Chris Stiles, the two guys that were the main researchers. I talked about them a bunch during our talk tonight, but it's called I believe it is just called the Shag. Yeah, it is called the Shag Harbour UFO Incident documentary films. If you Google that, you'll find it on YouTube. I also link to it from my website. My website is nighttimepodcast.com, and I have all my episodes broken down individually. If you go to episode 22 on the Shag Harbour incident, you'll see I have links to various articles and documentaries. This one that includes Don Ledger and Chris Stiles is very good because they're right on the ground, going through their documents and and really opening the doors. One thing that's coming up that people may be interested in, and I find this absolutely fascinating because my interest in the UFO, more so the UFO phenomenon, is more so in the kind of the basic nuts and bolts of it, but more so the personal stories people share. And what's coming up is a local student who's writing he's studying folklore, and he's writing his thesis paper on Shag Harbour, the town. And basically what he's writing about and researching, he's been working on it for 2 years now, I think. What he's researching and writing about is how something strange like a UFO sighting can affect the history of a town and go from an event to becoming kind of folklore as the story goes on. And he's about to publish and share his thesis shortly. And I'm very excited for that. I think he's timing it with the 50th anniversary as well.
Okay. Someone wanted to know if you knew anything about now I know you focus on the Eastern Seaboard, but do you have any information on the 1990 Montreal aerial phenomena? It was a metallic object about 540 meters wide over the rooftops of Bonaventure Hotel.
Yeah, I don't have any information on it. I've heard I've heard the basic details of the story. That's something that I plan to look into one day, but at this point I don't know. I probably don't know any more than the person asking the question.
Sure. Okay. Well, okay. One last question I have for you here is: how often do you put out your shows? And you do put a lot of work on your podcast because I know what it takes, and mine is just a plain conversation, and yours is a lot of work. How often do you put out your shows? Are they on a steady basis?
Yeah, I try to do every second, usually 2 a month. But sometimes, if something's really complicated, I'll delay it and kind of work on it and get it just right. So what my show is the big difference is, it's not like it's not just like yours. I love your show, and it's set up more like a radio show where it's conversation and discussion. in contemplation on the events. Where mine, I focus more so on the storytelling. So if I have an episode on Shag Harbour, it's generally not like talking about what may have happened. It's more so interviews with the witnesses and researchers, and it's all edited, so it's more like an audio documentary, I guess, so to speak, is the way I do it. I have and I cover all sorts of things, not just UFOs, but 2 a month is what's normal. And I'm working on a true crime story as well as a UFO story. But I plan to do more and more UFO stuff. It's what I think about all the time, and it's just about I kind of try to keep where I cover different topics. I try not to do any one topic too often for fear of alienating a section of the people who listen.
No pun intended there, alienated.
Yeah, I didn't even that was natural.
Yeah. All right. Hey, thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure and really enjoyable, and good luck with your show. One more time, just throw the URL, and you also have a Facebook page too, right?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. My website's nighttimepodcast.com, and there's links to all the social media there. And I want to thank you, Martin, for having me. But also, I just want to thank you for the work you put into your show. There's so few people that are covering the UFO phenomenon, especially in a down-to-earth, grounded, reasonable, logical way that you do. I find like your show is like a breath of fresh air. I've listened to so many and have looked for kind of the right UFO show, and I think that you do an awesome job. You keep it interesting with the different guests, but it's not bizarre, fringy stuff. It seems very reasonable, and you have an educated opinion, and you do a wonderful job talking to your guests and getting interesting thoughts out of them. What really blew me away was you had a guest cancel last minute 2 or 3 episodes ago, and you had, I think his name was George, your next door neighbor, or
Donnie.
Someone who lived. Donnie, yeah.
Yeah, he was visiting his father at the lake up here. I live in the middle of nowhere. He just happened to be here. It was just he's a listener to the show.
Yeah, but as a testament to your skills as an interviewer and your skills as just someone who can talk and keep a conversation going, that I think of all the episodes I listened to was one of my favorite. I sat and listened to the entire 2 hours on YouTube, but it's what you're doing is great, and I support your show financially, and I'd encourage anyone else who enjoys it to do so, because people like you who are doing it for a passion as opposed to doing it for money. People like us who are interested in it should be supporting you and helping you make the show as good as it can be. So I'm happy that I had found you, and I plan to listen to anything you put out.
Well, hey, thanks so much. It's very, very well appreciated. All right, everyone. So that's it for our show, and thanks so much. Next week we will be back here with let's see, John Hansen on the Rendlesham Forest case. And, with that nice compliment, you did forget about last night, didn't you? Thanks.
I enjoyed that. Nothing like a good plane crash, train wreck.
Yeah.
Just one thing I meant to mention this. Sorry to take it off the
rails. Sure, yeah, no problem. No, that's all right.
People right now, Oak Island's in Nova Scotia, and a lot of people watch that TV show. But a lot of people don't realize that there was once upon a time a guy researching Oak Island and a UFO connection. I haven't read the book yet, but he wrote a book in I think in 1971 where he presents his theory why he believes it was a UFO involvement in Oak Island. I plan to read that.
Wow.
Yeah.
How about that?
I don't know. On the cover of the book, he has a picture of the pyramids, so I don't know how they play into it, but I'm kind of excited to start it this weekend.
Wow. Isn't that something?
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Don't forget to go check out the Everything Else show, and you can see right there on the YouTube, it's everything-else-show.com. Coming up with our first episode. Those are going to be on Monday nights mostly. I do have someone really exciting that's going to be on a Sunday night. It's just because it's the only time I could get him on. I can't, until I get an absolute confirmation, can't say who that is. So anyway, we'll be here next week again, like I said, with John Hansen, and we're going to be talking about the Rendlesham Forest. Thanks so much, and keep your eyes to the sky.